you're familiar with the one-child policy. You do that for 40 years, you start running out of 30-year-olds. That's how math works. But most of it just has to do with development. When the United States started industrializing and urbanizing, we started back in the early 1800s. And so we have had generations to adapt to a more urbanized environment. And so we have this middle step where we went from farms to small towns to big towns to cities, and the cities have suburbs. And so there's always been a degree of elbow room put into the American model, which lowers the opportunity cost of having children. China didn't start to urbanize until 1980, and then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone. In the United States, we are a large population, 330 million. In order to round out our younger age groups, we really need to bring in about 2 to 4 million immigrants a year. And we're well under that right now, and that is something that will come back to bite us again and again and again in the decades to come. But we're also a settler society. None of us are actually from here. And so the United States is capable politically of sustaining large volumes of immigration for an extended period of time. Just now is not one of those moments. Immigration can be part of our solution. There's a lot of complications in that conversation, politically, logistically. That's a different conversation we can get into if you want to. But the United States is the largest economy in the world with the greatest upward mobility from people from the lower classes to the higher classes. And the attractiveness of that system, especially since it's mostly free, is robust. And you're right that when we do decide to have an open immigration system, we usually have no problem drawing in people. And that's before you consider what's about to happen to the wider world, where the delta between the U.S. and everyone else is going to be huge. The United States has over 300 million people. The Chinese have about 1.3 billion. So to move the needle, you don't just need to bring in 3 times as many people. You need to bring in 10 times as many people under age 40. It's not clear that there are enough people that are potentially migrant to salvage just China, assuming no one else moves anywhere else. The United States has has developed an interesting reputation of late of being a little bit racist, with white people being a little sketchy. But in China, which is 90% Han Chinese, they are blindingly racist to anyone who is not Han. And to think that there are going to be incentives that will draw people, especially in numbers, to the PRC is ridiculous, even before you consider the disconnect in terms of economic activity. But third, there's the governing system. The U.S. may be a flawed democracy, but a democracy it still is. China is a country where you are welded into your room when there's a health crisis. The degree that this casual dismissal of the very concept that private citizens have agency or interests is something that does not attract migrants. People forget that China is not a traditional nation state. It is an empire. Right. And they have expanded out and conquered other groups. And you do get migrant from those poorer minorities into the urban centers. But again, you can only do that once, because then you've hollowed out the countryside, and that is what has happened writ large throughout the entire system at this point. In the world before World War II, we had an imperial system with the empires duking it out over access to everything, and trade as a rule needed to be militarized, because every time there was a conflict, you would lose access to whatever happened, even if you weren't a party to the conflict. Shipping would be a target. So at the end of World War II, the Americans, who had the only Navy left in the game, said that they would put their Navy at the service of the global commons so that anyone could trade with anyone, anywhere, at any time, and access any market. And we came to know this as free trade and globalization. Now, there are 2 big implications from that. The first is that we were no longer in a world where if you wanted to be successful, you had to have iron ore and coal and steel and food. You only need one of them now. And you could trade for the other 3, and everyone started to industrialize together, starting from different points and moving at different speeds, but we all got on this path that we are all now very familiar with. And second, when people industrialized, they changed their personal habits, and national economies evolved as well. So it used to be that you were probably living on a subsistence farm, and when you do that, kids are free labor, so you have a bunch. But when you move into the town to take industrial and services jobs, kids go from being free labor to really expensive habits, and adults aren't stupid, so we had fewer of them. You play that forward 75 years, and it's not that most of the world is running out of children. That happened 30 years ago. It's that now the world has run out of working age adults and we're starting to run out of mature adults. Everyone's moving into mass retirement. So from a strategic point of view, globalization was based on America's commitment to the Cold War, which is long since over. And economically, the industrialization experience, the urbanization experience, has been about this bulge moving through the population structure that started with children, then turned into 20 and 30-somethings that was consumption heavy, then turned into 40 and 50-somethings, which were capital heavy, people saving for retirement, and now they're all moving into retirement. So the whole process has already played out. And under globalization, first with a lot of workers, then with a lot of capital, we got the technological explosions that we know. But these were all nothing more than a moment in time, a moment that lasted 75 years, but It's now over. And so we now have to go back to what we had before World War II, but without people. The key thing to keep in mind for shipping, let me throw it into three general categories. Number one, 80% of the stuff that enables people to grow food is transported internationally, whether it's equipment or fertilizer or fuel. Only 20% of food is traded internationally, but 80% you need the inputs to grow it in the first place. Number two, roughly half of all oil is shipped on the ocean blue, typically by supertanker, along with everything that comes out of the Persian Gulf. And then number three, safety on the waves is what allows us to have the East Asian manufacturing model, which is a fancy way of saying the manufacturing model, because roughly half of all manufactured goods are produced in East Asia. And you will get components coming from Thailand versus Indonesia versus China versus Korea versus Japan. But the key thing to remember is less than 1% of that shipping happens on land. Japan is an island. Most of the Southeast Asian countries are either islands or peninsulas, and they're ringed by mountains. So physical connections independent of maritime trade in Asia almost don't happen at all. How this happens on a decade's time scale, how the 2020s were always the decade that it was always going to break down in. But events in just the last couple of months are speeding this up. A lot of this is probably going to be front loaded. So think of what just happened in the first week of December. So the Europeans announced their plan for an oil export ban, and a lot of the details are being made up as they go on. It's a very European policy in that regard. But what it is encouraging is a split in the way we view oil from the Russian space versus the rest of the world, and the different types of crude coming out of the Russian space. So the stuff the Europeans are primarily concerned about is Urals crude that is exported west to the European space, and that can only be sold for $60 or less now, and that's affecting insurance and shipping rates and the type of vessels that go in. And we saw over the course of the last 2 years how disruptions in simply the type of vessel being available can generate supply chain snarls. So now we're doing this with energy, but there's also a crude grade that exports to the Pacific that doesn't touch the European space at all, that trades differently. We now, just in the Russian space, have two fundamentally different markets, not just for pricing, but for physical accessibility, for the ability to get ships and insurance to allow it to move. One of the reasons why the world has been so stable since 1945 is there's been one oil price. Now, it's modified by the length of the journey or the quality of the crude, but there's one oil price and everything is safe. The Europeans have now created a system where a lot of countries in Europe are now going to have a vested interest in interfering with Russian exports west. That's one pricing margin. That's one security paradigm. That's one insurance policy system. But then in the East, where the Europeans are not the players, it's a different crude grade at a different price point using different insurance systems by different countries. We have split the oil market now into at least three pieces, two Russian, one everything else, which means now countries no longer have a vested interest in making sure the oil flows everywhere all the time because we're not all in this together anymore.